Welcome back to Newsday. Yaga Africa has declared that the low turnout, logistic lapses, and fragile collation witnessed in Abuja's council elections held on Saturday is a stark warning for the 2027 general polls. In a statement, the civil society organization noted that while the election was conducted in a largely peaceful atmosphere, with voters able to cast ballots without any major disruption, turnout was low, with a lot of polling units recording limited participation. Yaga Africa stated that delays in the deployment of personnel and materials, along with the inadequate communication on polling unit relocations, undermined voter confidence and contributed to disenfranchisement. Now, with the 2027 general elections fast approaching, the organization is urging INEC to adopt a more detailed, projectized approach to logistics planning and execution. For an independent review of last Saturday's by-elections in Abuja, Kano, and River State, the program coordinator Africa of Yaga Africa, Ibrahim Farouk, joins us now as we take a look at the challenges and how the conduct of these polls could impact the credibility of future polls. Thank you for joining us on Newsday.
Thank you so much for having me on the show this afternoon.
Yes, good to be with you. So we'll start in Abuja, or the FCT. I mean, low voter turnout is not something that you should essentially expect to hear from the nation's capital. I mean, shouldn't that be the place with the most voter turnout? What happened in Abuja?
I totally agree with you that we should expect to see high levels of voter turnout for local council elections in the FCT because the Federal Capital Territory is a special creation that just has local council elections. We do not have a state house of assembly or an elected governor. But we saw low voter turnout, even though this was an improvement from the area council elections that we had in 2022, where voter turnout was at about 9%. For this election, voter turnout is at about 15%. Even though there's about a 6% increase over the last 4 years, it is still not anything to write home about or be happy about with the level of turnout that we saw on Saturday, the 21st of February.
Now, even though you said there was, it looks like progress to an extent compared to what we saw before, 9%, now 15%. What would you attribute this, let's call it voter apathy? What would you attribute it to? What factors?
So there's more than one factor that we can attribute this low level of voter participation to. I think first of all is that citizens are starting to lose trust and confidence in the institution that is responsible for managing our elections. Even though we must commend them, recommendations are due. And in your introduction, you spoke about how this was conducted in a peaceful atmosphere. And when we observed the collation process, for instance, we saw how INEC staff remained professional in the face of harassment and intimidation. But when you speak to citizens and residents of the FCT, you hear comments such as, "My votes would not count," or "the outcome of the elections are already predetermined, and so there is no point coming out to vote on election day." One of the things that we also observed in our preliminary statement was reassignment of voters from their previous polling units to new polling units. Even though INEC in its statement said there was no migration or reassignment, that what it did was to split polling units and create polling units close to those ones who were congested that had voters of over 1,250 persons. That also contributed. The restriction of movements also contributed to these low levels of participation because we had registered voters who were trying to move from their place of residence to the place where they registered to vote. But because of the restriction of movement on election day, I think those are just some of the few factors that contributed to this low level of turnout that we saw on Saturday.
And a lot of times, I think when people talk about elections in general, there's always this sense that young people should be engaged. There should be candidates that are able to excite voters, young voters, galvanize them to essentially come out and vote. Where are they in all of this? Because even just videos and anecdotes of people that are voting, it does seem to be a somewhat older population. So can you just speak to this in Abuja, but also in Rivers and Kano states?
So the situation in Abuja is also very similar to the same situation of things that we saw in Rivers and in Kano that they had. In January last month, IAG Africa released the first in a series called the National Voting Intention Survey. And from the survey, we found out that there are 3 things that are going to affect voters' turnout in elections. One of them is the quality of candidates that political parties are able to put forward. And Nigerians who were sampled in that survey said, if the candidates are not exciting, Nigerians are not going to come out and vote, especially young people who make up the largest demographic in our voters register. From those findings as well, citizens said that as long as INEC is able to deploy logistics effectively and efficiently, citizens are also going to come out and vote. And the third among those findings was as long as there's an assurance of security and that the elections are going to be conducted in a peaceful atmosphere, citizens are going to come out and vote. So the data is clear that 1, political parties and the candidate selection process must ensure that we have candidates that are exciting, especially for young people. It is clear that INEC needs to work on its logistics in terms of deployment, early arrival of materials, professionalism of its staff, and ensuring the strength of the collation process, and for security agencies who are also stakeholders in this process to ensure that citizens can go out and vote in a peaceful atmosphere in the subnational elections that we're going to have in Ekiti and Osun later this year, as well as the general elections in 2027.
You mentioned quite a number of observations that you made regarding the low turnout of voters, and earlier on you did mention a number of factors. For instance, some people feeling like their votes would not count, reassignment of votes from previous polling units, and the likes. But I would like to focus on the aspect that you mentioned in terms of INEC, where you said there was that citizens are losing confidence in INEC. And when you pair that with what we saw play out last week, for instance, with the displeasure of some Nigerians or significant number of Nigerians regarding the Electoral Act that was passed, specifically when it comes to the aspect of transmission, what would you say that INEC has to do to gain the trust of Nigerians ahead of 2027?
One of the things that INEC must do ahead of 2027 is a lot of public enlightenment, a lot of consultation with stakeholders and especially citizens. I can tell you that in the area council elections on Saturday, we noticed that there was a downtime on the INEC results viewing portal for a few hours. And it raises questions around whether this process was transparent. And you'd recall that in the 2023 general elections, the IREV had a glitch, and that didn't help with building public confidence around the transmission of results, even though at the end of voting on Saturday, INEC had uploaded at least 73% of results from various polling units onto the INEC results viewing portal known as the IREV. But when we see that there are these downtimes or these glitches, what INEC needs to come out and do is to explain to citizens what happened and give those reassurances that this is not going to happen again. Because the FCT election is an election with 1.6 million people. What happens when you have 100 million registered voters and you're having these downtimes?
Ibrahim, you're talking about downtime again, and do you think it's a coincidence, or are you starting to think that it's intentional? We have heard this story about glitches, downtime, and then an explanation always comes up later, assurances that are never followed through. Do you have a feeling or get a sense that with this pattern, that's what we'll probably see in 2027 election, another story of glitches?
So we do not expect that we'll have any stories about glitches ahead of the 2027 general elections because these area council elections, the subnational elections that we have in Ekiti and Osun provide an opportunity for INEC to show its preparedness ahead of the 2027 general elections, for observers and citizen groups to ask the right questions and ensure that INEC is ready, that the technology being deployed is up to date, and we're not going to experience any of these glitches. Citizens do not believe that INEC would deliberately seek to disenfranchise them and ensure that the results do not reflect the will of the people. But technology has its downtimes. What is important is the communication and accountability that takes place after these glitches, after these downtimes, if there are clear explanations about what has happened and safeguards to prevent reoccurrences in the future.
And, from the technology, I also would like to kind of go back to what you were discussing about candidates, because at the end of the day, this is about people. So in terms of the candidates that we saw in these last elections, and as we get closer to 2027, is there a sense that the candidates on the ballot are exciting enough, or are they not?
Well, we're going to have to wait and find out after primaries are conducted by political parties. But what is important to state here is that the Electoral Act of 2026 has mandated that political party primaries are going to be carried out either through a direct primary or through a consensus methodology. A direct primary means that every registered member of the political party has an opportunity within that constituency to determine who the candidate for that election is. But with a consensus, it becomes a lot more trickier, where some elders or stakeholders in the party are able to come together and sort of impose a candidate on the party or on the constituents against the will of the people in that constituency, so to speak. But as citizens, we must also always remain vigilant to ensure that the candidates who have competence, who have capacity, who have character, are also able to go through this candidate selection process and make it to the ballot and eventually into public office.
Well, you talked about INEC gaining the trust of the people, what they'll need to do in that regard. But now let's talk about the homework that INEC needs to do to ensure that they're actually ready for the polls. You mentioned that they still need to work on logistics, arrival of materials, downtime, and the likes. It sounds like this is rinse and repeat. If you could rate the performance of this election, even though you did say turnout was higher, 15%, how would you say it fared compared to what we've seen in the past?
So compared to what we've seen in the past, I think we should commend INEC where commendation is due. First and foremost, it was conducted under a very peaceful atmosphere. Even though one of the things that we noticed was that polling units did not open as and when due. Polling units are supposed to open at 8:30, and even by INEC's own statement, by its own admission, only 45% of polling units had opened by 8:30 a.m. in the FCT on the 21st of February. The other 55% of polling units had opened by 10 a.m. What this means for us is that even the time allocated for voting, because voting starts at 8:30 and is meant to end at 2:30, even though in some places we saw where voting closed earlier, we cannot continue with that. So things around deployment of materials, has to be something that INEC has to get spot on. But we must also commend INEC because in all the polling units observed, we noticed that there was deployment of the BVAS machine, the voters register was available for display, ballot papers were available, security officials were there, INEC officials and ad hoc officials, NYSC members were there as well. And through the collation process, even though we noticed some gaps and some fragility, like we mentioned in our statement, INEC also remained very professional in the face of harassment, intimidation. In some of the ward collation centers, there was some sporadic violence that was taking place, but INEC was able to go through with this collation process, which is one of the weakest links. But INEC must strengthen the collation process, ensure that IREV and electronic transmission works optimally, that the deployment of materials for election works optimally as well, that the BVAS machines, because the FCT area council elections was an election with about 2,800 polling units. In 2027, we're going to have close to 200,000 polling units, and we cannot afford to have anything go wrong.
Ibrahim Farouk of Yaga Africa, thank you very much for joining us today on Newsday.